Welcome to the Versus History Podcast with your hosts, Patrick O'Shaughnessy, Connell Smith, and Elliot Watson.
Hi, I'm Michael Sturza, and I have a new book coming out soon, The London Revolution, 1640 to 1643.
Welcome to the Versus History Podcast, folks. You've heard from Michael. It's myself, Patrick O'Shaughnessy, a history chappie, one of the editors of the podcast, and we'd love to welcome you, Michael. Thank you for joining us to talk all about your new book. How are you on this fine, rather wintry day where I am in the Kingdom of Bahrain?
Well, it's a balmy 40 degrees here in New York City, but not for long. It's going to go way down to about 20 tonight and tomorrow.
Ouch. There's me complaining. Well, it's nothing quite like that here in the Middle East. But irrespective of the weather, look, welcome to 2022. And we're really pleased that you've made time to come and talk to us all about your research and your most recent book, which is about London, strangely enough, for a New Yorker. But let's start here, Michael. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your background. As historian Professor Richard J. Evans says, before you read the history book, you should study the historian behind it a little. So let's treat ourselves, shall we? Over to you. Tell us about you.
Okay, well, very briefly, I've been a Marxist my entire adult life, and about 25 years ago, I became particularly interested in the English Revolution and Civil War. And about a dozen years ago, I actually started seriously reading about it and the background to it. I've participated over the decades in various demonstrations and around particular political defense work and so on, many different issues, and always with a particular orientation to labor and the working class, as any good Marxist would. So I wrote the book to defend the Marxist view against the right-wing revisionist historians who were trying to write revolution out of history. The fundamental contradiction in 17th century England was between the capitalist economy and the feudal political system. The bourgeois revolution that began in London and led to the Civil War was an even more contradictory event than the French Revolution in 1789. There was no wholesale abolition of feudalism, no systematic suppression of the aristocracy as a whole, no land given to the peasantry. The French Revolution, longer delayed by absolutism, was an even more explosive event, but both brought about the end of feudalism. The main difference was that the English aristocrats, particularly the gentry, participated in the capitalist economy. French aristocrats didn't. This participation by England's rulers in the money economy introduced a political skew into the revolutionary events in London. Aristocrats who opposed the king were not opposed to monarchy in principle. They were moderates who wanted to reform the existing feudal system. But it was the presence of the armed citizens of London in the streets, some 100,000 strong, that brought down the king.
Wow, thank you very much indeed, Michael. I think I'm right in saying we're well over 100 episodes now. You're the first Marxist historian, sort of self-proclaimed, self-championed Marxist historian that we've ever had. So that's interesting for us. Let's just go there just briefly, shall we? Just to orientate the conversation. What constitutes a Marxist historian as opposed to any other type of historian, be it economic, intentionalist, structuralist, social, revisionist? Over to you. What actually is a Marxist historian in a nutshell?
Neither the right-wing nor liberal historians have ever been successful in explaining why revolutionary change occurs. Some even deny that a revolution took place in England at all. Marxist class analysis is based on the principle that people are firstly impacted by their economic position in society. It's not the only factor, but it's the most fundamental. It'll become clear, I think, as we talk about the English Revolution in a little more detail. But it's the opposing economic interests of different social classes that cause conflicts between them. The central question in any society is labor. Who performs it? Who doesn't? What types of goods are produced? Under what conditions? Who benefits? These are the prerequisite questions that Marxists look to and that all historians, I believe, should look to in analyzing historical episodes. When revolutions occur, the social class that rules society and monopolizes its wealth is overthrown by a lower class that permanently realigns the economic and legal systems to suit their own requirements. The English Revolution that began in London is one example of this. It abolished feudal constraints and interference by the monarchy in particular in the capitalist economy. And eventually it made possible the Industrial Revolution in first Britain and later, of course, the US.
Of course. Thank you very much indeed then, Michael. Okay, this is really interesting because we have had discussions, many on this podcast, about the English Civil War, but they tend to have been shaped by sort of discussions about Puritanism and the divine rights of kings, and the extent to which Cromwell fitted traditional nonconformist Protestant models, or was he a Congregationist, etc. So this is going to take us a different angle, I think. Okay, so the English Revolution then, for someone that had never heard of it, we've got an alien from space that's just arrived. How would you explain what happened in brief to that alien, let's say in 2 to 3 minutes? What was the English Revolution? Over to you.
It can't really be done in brief.
No, it can't. The fool's error in that question, I'm afraid.
Let me start here. We have to address what made England different from other countries on the continent, because these are the specifics that pertain to this situation, which is always very important. So the first thing is that absolutism never fully took hold in England. This grew out of the Barons' Rebellion of 1215 and Magna Carta, and it led to the development of a parliament with limited but real powers that attenuated the monarchy. Secondly, was the early dying out of what was called villeinage or serfdom in the late 14th and 15th centuries. And this grew out of the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, which was an enormous, short-lived but enormous and explosive event. It resulted in the peasants being freed from the land and labor service to the lords, and was replaced by an arrangement called copyhold, a written claim to the land in exchange for rent, a money rent, that their descendants could inherit the farm upon payment of a largish fee or fine. It was in essence a capitalist contract. This replaced feudal obligation with bourgeois payment, and it opened the way to the spread of market relations in the countryside during the 15th and 16th centuries, as well as a large increase over time in production and overseas trade, especially under Elizabeth, so that by 1600, England was an economically capitalist country. But the growth of the capitalist economy caused distortions in the rigidly hierarchical feudal social system, which caused political and religious conflict. In January 1642 was the king's attempt to arrest 5 members of parliament, House of Commons. No monarch had ever entered the House before, much less to arrest sitting members. And the plebeian population of London, arms in hand, occupied the streets for 2 days and nights in defense of parliament against the king's threat to forcibly close it down. The London militia went over to the people. Charles I fled the city, and the feudal government collapsed. It was replaced by a majority of the gentry in the House of Commons, in alliance with the leadership of the Puritan movement, which was largely the free trading Atlantic merchants who had come to power as part of a Puritan electoral suite. Hopefully that puts it into a nutshell and into some context.
Even better than a sort of working introduction. Thank you very much. All right. So what were the key causal factors that led to revolution, and what were the main issues at stake? I know you've touched on some of that already, but how would you summarize that?
Right. So we have this big social disruption and contradiction in early 17th century society. And the early Stuart kings attempted to resolve that contradiction by increasing the absolute power of the monarchy. Charles I refused to call a parliament for 11 years. And attempted to reinforce all aspects of the feudal system. He also supported conservatives in the state Church of England against Puritans, who were persecuted, driven out of the church, and sometimes out of England. Opposition came from all social classes, including some nobles. And in 1640, Charles was forced to call a new parliament. Now, of course, different social classes had different political aims. The gentry, who were privileged landowners, dominated in the House of Commons. But the middle and lower gentry were often willing and able to take an active managerial role in capitalist projects, so that their interests largely aligned with those of bourgeois merchants and early manufacturers. They were still part of the feudal ruling class, however, with an antagonistic relationship to the peasantry, who were their copyhold tenants. They often sought to improve their estates at copyholders' expense, raising rents, shortening leases, and throwing peasants off the land by enclosing them. Enclosure forced many peasants to migrate to towns, especially London, where they became pools of desperately poor casual labor. Gentry participation in the money economy brought them into conflict with the monarchy over property rights, taxation, and personal liberty. They therefore sought to reform the feudal political system by imposing limits on the king's power. They had no ideas about overthrowing monarchy. The middling people, on the other hand, were the base of the London Puritan movement. This was the large stratum of petty bourgeois artisan craft workers, shopkeepers, and domestic traders, who as Puritans were consistent Protestants. They wanted to eliminate all traces of Catholicism from the Church of England. Now, this was a trans-class movement and had a general effect throughout English society. But the middling people were the most radical and militant due to their social position. In 1640, when a new parliament was finally called, they demanded the abolition of episcopacy, that is, rule of the church by bishops, through mass petitions and demonstrations at parliament. We have to remember that in this time in history, church and state were heavily intertwined, and the king was the head of both. So abolition of the church hierarchy would mean the fall of the monarchy. Puritanism was thus a revolutionary movement against feudalism.
Okay, next question then. An interesting one. What were the political alignments for and against the revolution, and who provided its leadership?
The king was forced to rely on the nobility and the upper gentry for support, but he was also supported by the leaders of the royally chartered monopoly overseas trading companies, for example, the East India Company. These bourgeois merchant princes completely monopolized foreign trade and also regulated domestic production. They supported the monarchy through customs duties, loans, and gifts, and served as bankers to the aristocracy. And they were also the oligarchic rulers of towns like London, and in particular London, which was certainly the largest by a long shot of towns in England at the time. But in the late 1620s and 30s, a new class of Atlantic merchants became very wealthy, engaging in free trade of tobacco and provisions to Virginia. And unlike the monopoly company merchants who got their charters from the king, these guys were engaging in free trade, and they were not beholden to the king for their wealth. They were radically Puritan in politics and religion, known as independents. And in the 1630s, they allied with Puritan aristocrats to found new colonies in the Americas for Puritan refugees, such as Massachusetts Bay. They aggressively attacked Spanish interests in the Caribbean, and they became leaders of the Puritan movement in London due to their extensive commercial ties with middling class producers and retailers. They backed Parliament with money and administrative expertise, and they pushed for active prosecution of the war against the king. They were, in short, the bourgeois vanguard of the English Revolution. And it was only the support of the London Puritan movement, largely led by these Atlantic merchants, that made it possible for Parliament to overcome the king. So what resulted was a political alliance between a large section of the gentry in the House of Commons and the Atlantic merchants in London. And this alliance gave the gentry confidence that they could control the middling class movement, which was also, by the way, often followed by lower class wage workers, such as ferrymen on the Thames or porters. The alliance eventually betrayed the middling people's interests after the Civil War, undermining the revolution and leading, and was one of the important reasons for the restoration of the monarchy. But
No, it's absolutely fascinating stuff, Michael, and I'm going to hit you with a curveball if that's okay. Obviously, said to our listeners during this interview that you are from the United States of America and you're talking extensively about the English Revolution. We know Puritanism had some role to play in early European or English-centric migration to what became the 13 British colonies of North America, the Great Puritan Migration of the 1630s. I mean, Boston was founded, I think, in 1630. How important generally is the English Revolution to America's colonial history, or how is it viewed in the modern United States of America today, either by yourself as a Marxist historian or sort of generally by Americans? And obviously America's a big country and it's very diverse, so that will differ. But is it an important historical issue in America, or is it not?
Yes and no. Obviously, the American society as a whole originated from England, and Puritanism was and Puritan exiles, I should say, were an important part of that. In its day, Puritanism, as I said, was a revolutionary movement insofar as it was put an end to feudalism and helped to overthrow the feudal system. That was then. Today, all kinds of religious, non-religious obscurantism exists in various forms and run rampant, not only in the US, but in many countries around the world. Today, Puritanism, to the extent, or whatever might be described as Puritanism, is reactionary. It is no longer a progressive movement any more than capitalism is. Capitalism was progressive in the 17th century. but certainly by the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, it had ceased to be.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, I just mentioned it because I had flashes in my mind of my history classes, even though I'm a history teacher myself, back some years ago, when I learned that some of those involved in the execution of Charles I actually fled to, I think, Massachusetts. So yeah, I mean, really interconnected history. Okay, then let's have a look at this question here. Why do you call, Michael, the summer of 1643, and I quote, the crisis of the revolution?
Because the House of Commons very nearly voted to surrender to the king. In July of 1643, all three of Parliament's armies were badly defeated by the king's forces. The main reason was that Parliament itself was divided over the war. Even at that late date, a minority of the gentry MPs and majority in the House of Lords favored a negotiated settlement with the king on whatever terms they could get from him. This peace party had prevented Parliament from providing their armies with men and supplies, despite repeated pleas from their generals in the field. There was the peace party had a base in London. The population had become polarized over the increased taxes needed to pay for the war. The military crisis brought matters to a head. The Lords wrote new peace proposals to be sent to the king. It would return all major towns, forts, and the Tower of London to his control. The revolutionary London government petitioned the Commons to reject the Lords' proposals and urged vigorous prosecution of the war. For the first and only time since the revolution, 18 months earlier, they mobilized their base of supporters in a demonstration at Parliament. 5,000 men showed up to urge rejection of the peace proposals and continuation of the war. And the Commons did reject the Lords' propositions by only 7 votes. So it was a very near thing. And the political split foreshadowed the one that finally occurred after the war in 1649, when the monarchy and House of Lords were abolished and the Commonwealth, or a republic by another name, was established.
Okay, this is a really interesting question, and I'm sure lots of our listeners are going to want to hear this one. Why a Marxist class analysis of this history? How does it hold value, and how, if at all, does it shed new light on this historical episode?
Well, we sort of talked about that nearer to the beginning. In any society, the one thing you cannot escape is the technical level that exists. Ancient Egyptians and Incas were able to build pyramids, but they were not able to build the Empire State Building. Not because they didn't think of it, but because they did not possess the technology necessary to do it. So these are we often talk about the miracles of modern science, and to us they are, but the miracles of yesterday seem commonplace today, right? Radio was once incredibly innovative.
Absolutely.
Today, I suppose people still listen to it, but certainly the younger generation barely knows what it is, I suppose.
Very true.
And they certainly wouldn't give it the time of day. So the point is that these are the constraints that any society operates within. And that has to be understood. Marxism, the goal of Marxism, the goal that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels wrote about, they didn't write very much about communism per se. They mainly wrote about capitalism and history. But their social goal was to abolish class society, and through the economic abolition of scarcity. When goods are scarce, somebody has to make decisions about who gets what. Not surprisingly, the ruling class takes the greatest share. But if everyone had enough to live on and had all of their material needs met, that would be a very different kind of society. One where classes would simply be dissolved because they would no longer be necessary. So this is what I meant by the permanently realigning the economic and legal systems to suit their own requirements. If we can abolish scarcity, which capitalism and industry give us the possibility of doing, those miracles of science I was referring to, and they were distributed equally. That's essentially what socialism and communism is driving for. A qualitatively higher level of economic production and a corresponding expansion of political freedom.
Okay, moving towards the final question or two then. So how is the London Revolution relevant to today's world here in 2022?
Right. So social, as I was just saying, social revolutions bring about greater personal freedom and participation in society. What we today call democratic rights arose out of the actual experience of the revolution in London. The Second Amendment to the US Constitution, for example, originates in the actions of the armed people occupying the streets of London in defense of Parliament against the king. Hamilton and Madison both argued in the Federalist Papers that militias, which they defined as citizens with arms, were the guarantee of the people's liberties. In the 1640s, there were many pamphlets and debates going on about questions around the sovereignty of the people, the relationship between church and state, whether the people had a right to overthrow their rulers, and democratic ideas that devolved from this were codified in the English Bill of Rights in 1689 and the Bill of Rights to the US Constitution 100 years later, which in turn influenced the French revolutionaries of 1789. In England, the participation of aristocrats in the capitalist money economy led to the retention of the monarchy after the revolution in 1688. And we still see this today. It's a ludicrous spectacle. But the role of these feudal leftovers is no less reactionary now than it was then. The only difference is that today they help prop up the decaying capitalist system. In fact, I noticed that the New York Times today calls the monarchy, quote, a stabilizing force for the government in one of its articles. As I said earlier, capitalism was progressive in the 17th century, but around the turn of the 20th century, it no longer was. And in the middle of the 19th, Karl Marx wrote that the future for humanity was either going to be socialism or barbarism. And it seems kind of obvious that today we are moving at a pretty rapid clip towards barbarism. Whatever forms that may take, could be a new world war, fascism, economic or environmental collapse. The cause is rooted in the capitalist profit system. The English Revolution serves as an example, I believe, both positive and negative, of how an outmoded social system can and must be replaced. And my book is an attempt to draw the appropriate historical lessons.
Thank you, Michael. Now, I can't resist this final question before we talk about your book and where people can get hold of it. The Age of Revolution is a key topic in history, syllabi curricula the world over, but definitely in obviously Britain and America too. What one thing would you want history teachers or curriculum designers to take from your scholarship and make sure that they implement in their lessons when they're teaching young people or undergraduates? So what one thing would you want teachers to bear in mind about the London Revolution or the English Civil War that they might not otherwise? Over to you.
Simply, I think the most important thing for any student or teacher of history to come to grips with is that over time, things that are progressive in one era become not so in another. That is
never a truer word spoken. In Marxist parlance, this is called historical materialism, sometimes called dialectical materialism. What's important to understand is that there is a constant back and forth of conflict and change, and that, again, in my book, I'm trying to show how that developed. Thank you very much indeed, Michael. Okay, let's conclude by talking about your book and how people can get hold of it. So what's its title and who's it published by and where can we get it?
The book is titled The London Revolution, 1640 to 1643. It is subtitled Class Struggles in 17th Century England. It's published by the Mad Duck Coalition. And if you go to their website, you will see that book and some others that they put out. My book is now available for pre-order. It will be published at the end of March.
Fantastic. And Michael, if people want to get in touch with you to ask you questions,
the Mad Duck Coalition's website does have a contact form. By all means, please submit to it.
Fantastic. Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed the interview. I certainly did, Michael. I really have had some fresh perspectives on a topic that I learned at school myself, and then I've taught a lot in my own teaching over the years. So it's always good to get fresh perspectives, fresh insight, and a completely different way of looking at it. I've looked at it very much through a sort of religious lens, or from the sort of perspective of the death of a monarch and then the rise of different, I suppose, non-conformist groups after, like the Levelers, etc. But this is completely fresh, completely different, completely new. Whether you agree with it or not, ladies and gentlemen, it's certainly that, I think. So thank you very much indeed for coming onto the Versus History podcast, Michael, to share your insight, your wisdom and your expertise and these fresh perspectives, which definitely deserve an ear. So thank you very much. We wish you all the very best with your book, and we hope you'll drop by to the Versus History podcast and speak again with us sometime.
Thank you very much for having me, Patrick. All of the events and aspects that you mentioned, of course, are very important. Some of them are addressed in my book, but this is a very rich period with very rich material, and a lot we can all learn from it.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the Versus History podcast. Visit us at www.versushistory.com and follow us at Versus History on Twitter and Instagram. You can download all episodes from iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or from wherever you get your podcasts.